You're listening to the On Humans podcast, a show which makes new research about humanity more accessible to everyone and more meaningful, the big questions about our self-understanding. I'm your host, Ilari Mäkelä, and today's episode continues on a two-part mini-series on the role of climate in shaping the human story. In episode 1, we looked at the way that an ancient climate change helped pave the way for the very beginnings of humanity itself. And the second one is about historic times. My guest is Professor Tirthankar Roy from the London School of Economics, where he teaches a renowned course on the economic history of colonialism. I met him recently at an event at the British Academy, where he slipped to my hand a very thin new book. The book was called The Origins of Colonialism and was a very exciting read. And so here we are. And this episode has really two sides to it. On the one hand, it offers a completely novel perspective on the beginning of the British rule in India and European rule in Asia and Africa more generally. And Roy's argument here, taking India as the example, is that for too long we have tried to understand the process by mainly looking at what the Europeans were doing. To understand how a small group of European merchants were able to become the rulers of the lands of India, we have to look at what the Indians themselves were doing. And to understand this, we have to understand the climate, we have to understand the weathers, we have to understand the rains, the rivers and the waters. But even this particular argument aside, Roy is an immensely knowledgeable historian. And I think that listening to him discuss these issues will help, I think, anyone, whether very familiar with the topic or not, gain new ideas, new ways to picture, to imagine this complicated, many-faced, very long, sometimes slow, sometimes fast process that is often just lumped under this one monumentally charged term, colonialism. Given that it's a very charged topic, I'm sure that some listeners will have thoughts, comments on where they think that Roy gets things right, where he might get things wrong. If you have such ideas, you can head to onhumans.substack.com, find the episode page, and leave your comment there. There's a link to it also in the show notes. But whoever you are, wherever you are, thank you so much for being here, taking your time. If you enjoyed this and you haven't done so yet, do hit the subscribe button. Do give this show 5 stars on your podcast player if you think that I deserve it. And do share the episode with a friend if you think that they would enjoy it. And before we get started, just very briefly, to all the wonderful people who support me at patreon.com/onhumans. Thank you so much. Your support makes this work not only possible, but also all the more meaningful. This episode is for you. And so without further ado, I bring to you the world's leading expert on the economic history of India, Professor Tirthankar Roy. Professor Tirthankar Roy, welcome to On Humans.
Yeah, I'm glad to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
You have a book out with no lesser of a topic than the origins of colonialism. Most people, when they imagine European colonialism, might be thinking of armies marching under a flag. You start with ports. Why?
Great question. The emergence of European empires, especially the British Empire, really started from the sea. The British East India Company was a body of merchants which took over power from an Indian state in the late 18th century in Bengal region of India. And the British Empire in India started from that episode. Most accounts of this change will look at politics, will look at the interests of the actors. They don't give enough weight on the geographical dimension of the story. There were extremely large, very powerful empires inland. The Mughal Empire. It was breaking up in the 18th century, but breaking up into quite strong and powerful successor states. They had a military, they were funding the military, they knew how to fight wars, and they had a system in place. The merchants were not a military power, and very often merchants will not be ready to take over states because it's not immediately a profitable thing to do. So how did this transition happen? And this is a kind of open question in Indian economic history. You can ask that question for Africa, West Africa, partly East Africa. You can ask that question for Southeast Asia.
Well, actually, may I inject there a possibility? Should we maybe focus on making a rough division, because you focus on India and then the question, or South Asia, and then the question of how much can this explain other forms of colonialism. How accurate would it be to say that there is a major divide between what happens in what traditionally is called the New World versus the Old World. And the story that you're telling is an attempt to explain the Old World colonialism, Afro-Eurasia colonialism, not Americas, not Cortez, not John Smith, not Australia, but what happens especially in Asia and in Africa.
Yes, indeed. I mean, that divide does work. It's a good place to start. There was certainly a lot of commercial interest involved in the British expansion in the Atlantic as well. However, the general distinction is between settlers creating mini states and states that they deliberately made to look very similar to the state forms or institutions back home, and states that were created out of commercial activity or conquest or any other interference, if you like, in an old world setting where there are already states. And the question there is a little different one. I mean, what kind of equations there were between these Europeans and the indigenous elite?
And so I guess in the American context, for example, there are elites, for example, in the Aztecs and the Incas. But what happens is because of, I don't know, guns, germs, and steel and other factors, they collapse very rapidly. And you have massive depopulation because of especially the European germs, but also violence. And as a consequence, you have a lot of abandoned land onto which you have Portuguese speakers, Spanish speakers, English speakers, a bit of French speakers moving and setting up their states. Very similar thing happens in Australia later on. And when we look at especially Asia, what's very striking is that let's take Guns, Germs, and Steel. Actually, I think this could be a good vehicle. Is that Guns, Germs, and Steel by Jared Diamond is a book trying to explain why is it that Eurasia, to some extent Afro-Eurasia, is such a kind of, they always have the biggest empire in world history. They always have the newest guns in world history. And that is a very, very important question if we want to explain what happens to the Americas. But that doesn't explain why it is this wet, far northern, western corner of Eurasia, Britain, Netherlands, etc., that then later governs South Asia, Southeast Asia, etc. And so, in some sense, I guess the story that you're telling helps us address that second layer of European colonialism, is that why these somewhat even-looking powers in Eurasia end up tilting so that suddenly it's these European, often companies ruling Asia. Would that be a right way to frame this in the big story of colonialism?
Yes, to some extent, yes, that works. But there are two different dimensions to it. I mean, one is coming from Europe, the impulse to go out across the oceans, and the ability to do that with gunships or good maritime knowledge. Knowledge of trade routes, knowledge of where settlements are, how to survive. Well, the other dimension here, which we often overlook, is what's happening on the places where these empires are emerging. And my book is largely about that side. How do these two forces join together? Because you cannot really explain the emergence of empires without either one of these. I mean, what's happening in the regions and this impulse to expand across the seas.
Very good. And I guess the expanding across the seas, you mentioned that that's one of the key elements. And I think to give a further kind of a map of what kinds of things are happening, let me try this on you, and you tell me if I'm on the right track. Is that because the European expansion starts from the seas, what you get in the first phase is that across Africa, across Asia, you start having ports. You start having European. First, it's probably just a little building somewhere where the Europeans, I don't know, store something. But these trading ports, some of them start growing, and they specialize in different kind of trade. In Western African coast, they specialize in human trafficking. Along the coast of India, they specialize much more in bringing Indian textiles, for example, to Europe. But first, you have this kind of almost like dotted pearls of ports that go across Africa and Asia. And some of these become very famous. Hong Kong would be maybe the most famous of these. But you have this kind of happening everywhere. And what happens later is that some of these, for example, not Hong Kong, but some of these become bases to launch inland expansion. And that happens in India. That, for example, that doesn't happen in China. It does happen in India. Why does it happen in India? Why does it happen in Southeast Asia? Why does it happen later in Africa? That this is the question that you're trying to understand.
Absolutely, and that's largely the question around which this book builds. What's happening on the seaboard spaces, these geographies? And as you mentioned, I mean, this I mean, if you look at, let's say, late 17th century map, and you can actually spot all these port cities where Europeans are. There are little dots and big dots everywhere, all across the tropical regions along the seaboard. What we have to understand here is that the Indian Ocean region has been trading for a very long time before Europe. I mean, the Europeans landed there because they had these trading goods already being sold in the ports. Now, some of these ports were very large, and the Europeans in the 17th century, when they came to India, they would typically land up in Surat in Western India, which is a very large early modern port, very cosmopolitan. All sorts of people were doing trade there. It belonged to the Mughal Empire, but the Mughal Empire kind of ruled it from a distance. And they were not, they understood its value, but they didn't actually, they kind of decentralized a lot of the operations and power to local governors. But you have counterparts in West Asia, in Southeast Asia, you have similar port cities almost everywhere. So there were these ports, and the Europeans in the 17th century would first come there, deal with the governor, get a license to trade, and then trade.
Are these kind of like almost like an embassy kind of situation, like a little extraterritorial place which has its own laws, and in the same way as an embassy would nowadays, versus how much are these something very different? How much are they in the beginning actually just a business operation that's fully operating under the local laws?
Most people would be looking for trade on their own terms without having to negotiate with a local big shot. But that would never happen. I mean, there are big shots everywhere. I mean, especially, I mean, that's what defines the old world, that everywhere power is already institutionalized. And in a bigger place, of course, you have to go to the local court and talk to the governor, give him or court people gifts, and then get a license. In a smaller place, the amount of the gift, the amount of the extent of the negotiations will be much simpler. And that's what many people will be looking for, a good trading spot where you don't have to invest a lot of resources into this process of getting permission to trade.
And they were there to trade. I mean, I think this is the really interesting thing in your approach, is that there is a certain kind of, I'm sure it has some truth in it, but a bit of a naive approach, which is just to say, why did the Europeans colonize so much of Asia? It's because they could. But I mean, you write, you have quite an interesting line in your book, which is, quote, the company worked to earn money for its shareholders. Colonization was not a way to earn money. It was even wasteful, as some directors believed, unquote. And so that from the point of view of the actual business people, at least originally, who land on the Indian coast, for example, they were not there to set up a colonial enterprise. They were there to trade. And yet things change. And the question is, why did things change?
Absolutely. And one way to start answering that question is to look at the chronology. The East India Company, the British East India Company, at that time, the English company, was set up in 1600. And it was effectively a colonial power only around 1800. So for 200 years, it didn't actually think that this is a good idea.
Well, hold on a second. I think someone could, of course, say that for 200 years it could not do it, even if it would have wanted to. So we should maybe return to this question of how much was it a lack of capacity versus a lack of will.
These causalities are mixed up, but that's a very good way of understanding what had changed, which is the configuration of power inland. Because that changed, that the East India Company could do it. But that was not the only thing. The Mughal power weakening was not the only opportunity they had. They were still not an army. There were plenty of other armies in India. So why not them? Why these people? And for that, I think we need to bring in this other element, which is the seaboard advantage, if you like, a comparative advantage of the coastal regions, which is that they were much less exposed to famines. They were connected to the outside world. They were fairly rich in terms of resources and money. Not always in political power, but there were structural advantages. And what the English traders were doing is to create hundreds of bases using that advantage. And some of these, as you mentioned before, emerged as hubs of both commercial and political power. And once that process happens, then the sea can actually emerge quite successfully as a major center of power, because it's drawing wealth and skills from the inland, which is in trouble. And that is the key added process that we need to bring in here.
Yeah, so the difference between the coastal and the inland, and not just because the coast, also because the coast is where the ships land, but also because of climate, right?
Yeah,
Because of
indeed.
geography. So that's the theory, that's the suggestion, the hypothesis. So what's the geographical difference between the coast and the inland?
The geographical difference is this. I mean, much of it is semi-arid tropics. This is a technical term. I mean, so what that means is that these are the dry tropics over which very close to the two tropic lines, imaginary lines, which are the hottest places in the world. Extremely arid, so hot that for 3 or 4 months, peak summer, everything, all water dries up. But they also have something called the intertropical convergence zone, which brings seasonal rains, which in most places are called monsoons. That's true of West Africa. That's true of India. Now, when you have this burst of rains for a few months and extreme aridity for the rest of the year, you have a very peculiar climatic situation. You have, of course, heavy monsoon dependence. Everything depends on the monsoon, especially the agricultural production cycle. You have very high drought risk. If anything goes wrong with the monsoon strength, you have a disaster. You have a famine. But at the same time, because the monsoons are usually pretty regular and pretty heavy, you can actually create quite a good agricultural system without too much effort, because the water you don't have to harvest; it falls from the sky. And many of the inland states in these regions lived on this monsoon dependency. They could create fairly strong states based on this benign agricultural conditions for maybe 6 months in a year. But they also had to deal with occasional droughts, famines, and disasters, and also low soil fertility. So you have strong states, but you also have high risk situations.
So this is a high output, high risk situation.
It's a high output, high risk. I mean, that's one way of putting it, yes. So the Mughal Empire was a land-based state which lived like this. But the coastal regions are somewhat free of these constraints for lots of reasons. They can be located in the semi-arid areas, but they are usually not very semi-arid, not very arid, because they have access to a deltaic river, so water is available throughout the year. Often the climate is benign because of sea breeze. In lots of ways, they are less constrained and they're more food secure, if you like.
So in the Indian case, for example, Mumbai would be more secure than Delhi.
You can put it that way. Although technically Mumbai was a very bad choice for a trading settlement.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah. Well, broadly right. I mean, it was much more water secure. But the water quality was very bad. It's still bad.
Oh yeah, I suffered from it.
Yeah, I don't know of anyone who didn't.
Yes, I love Mumbai. It's an amazing city, and but every time I visited, I have felt it. So yes.
No, I lived in it. I lived in that city for 12 years, and
oh, really? Yes.
Yeah, I mean, we have had episodes of all sorts of enteric problems in the family for many years. But then I was very pleased to see, going back to the 17th century British sources, when they inherited this island from the Portuguese crown, I think, and then they didn't quite know what to do with it. And there were for almost 50 years, people were complaining. I mean, what is this place? I mean, you have to travel miles to get clean water. I mean, all our soldiers are down with stomach upset. I mean, how do you fight a battle with this sort of environment?
So by the way, let's return to the big picture, but let's stay here maybe for just a couple of minutes. Why? Why did they stay? Why did it grow to be one of the greatest cities in the world?
Well, that really happens much later. I mean, for a long time, they didn't quite understand the value of this, but it had a huge advantage, which is a very convenient port. The water comes inland, and all pre-modern ports need that, a kind of inland channel, and the ships can move into a place which is not so exposed to the storms or monsoon flooding, and Mumbai had that. So there was that advantage, but that advantage didn't really deliver much until the time when the inland was in turmoil because of the rising Maratha power. Surat city, which was effectively under British control, was exposed to that turmoil. And the governors increasingly thought that now the time has come for Mumbai. Let's develop this as a rival. And that strategy succeeded quite dramatically in the 19th century.
Okay, well, great. Let's continue. So, to understand that later phase, for example, in the story of Mumbai, we have to understand the big story that you have been telling. So, there is this difference between the inland and the coast. The inland is a high risk, high reward place, especially high reward if what you want to do is grow a state, because a state is based on tax. And how do you tax things in the 1600s, 1700s? You tax agriculture. The inland is where there's agriculture, there's farming, there's tax, there are big states. However, they are high risk states because you might end up having a catastrophic drought or something. In the coast, would it be right to say it's a lower reward? If trade aside, it's a lower reward, much lower risk situation. And then when you plug it into trade, you get also high rewards.
Something like that, yes. I mean, we have to understand how the politics in that kind of a place really works. The Mughal Empire was very powerful, but its power was decentralized to the regions. So if you have, say, 10 quite powerful provinces, some of them as big as countries, and you rule them through governors who are sent from the center, and they are loyal, you don't actually have to spend a lot of money in building a central army. And the Mughals really were doing that kind of a setup, political setup. And as far as we know, almost all pre-modern empires in this region were reliant on this decentralization of power. The British changed that. It's the only major state which actually centralized the army, created a salaried, pensioned body of soldiers. And that, in this kind of context, was an enormous asset. It could beat everybody. But that comes much later. But that's a huge divergence in strategy of building a state.
Interesting. Okay. So now let's look at this distinction between the inland and the coast. The coast gets these cities, which we discussed, which is everywhere, both in India and in China, for example. You end up having these kind of coastal settlements. China later on, but nevertheless. In India, they eventually become bases for European, especially British, excursions inland, and these people who, according to you, were not interested in colonizing originally, were not interested in the wasteful and expensive business of running a state, people who were there to trade, end up doing exactly those things. How does understanding this the sea breeze and the monsoon risk, how does it help us understand how that happens?
Well, one direct answer to your question is that what's happening in the late 18th century, not just in India, but in several other parts of the world, which is a lot more conflicts breaking up as some of these huge centralized empires are in trouble because their constituencies are not very reliable anymore. And the Mughal Empire is breaking up extremely quickly between, say, 1720 and 1750.
Is there a reason, by the way, in the climate, if this is happening around the world, is there any knowledge that there would be like an increased drought risk across the world or some like kind of a mini climate change?
There is a hypothesis that there is, but there are a series of extreme drought events which weaken some of these empires. But the evidence of that, as far as I'm aware, is not very strong. At least the connection between politics and climate is not very strong. But what we can definitely accept is that if you have this vulnerability built in, then an episode of conflict will weaken everyone. No one wins because all are equally vulnerable. So in that kind of a context, a seaboard power has a structural advantage because it's not constrained by this risk of famine or food insecurity or not having access to more resources. For quite a long time, Bombay, Madras, and Calcutta, the premier ports, were buying food from the sea, from Southeast Asia, Africa, but it was also Southeast Asia was a big resource. So these port cities had that kind of options. The inland cities didn't have those options. So conflict has different implications for these two geographical zones, and that's part of the story. But the other part of the story is that when you do have this conflict situation breaking up, as in the late 18th century, what you do get is a large number of wealthy people, skilled people, educated people are leaving the inland capitals. The major Mughal cities are depopulating, and not just depopulating, some of the most powerful people are leaving. Merchants, bankers, artisans, they are leaving. Elite people who supply services to the court. And where are they going?
They're going to the beach.
Kind of. I mean, from Surat, they're going to Bombay. From Coromandel, they're going to Madras. From Western Bengal or Northern India, they're going to Calcutta. Now, without that migration, you cannot really explain the emergence of the empire.
Interesting.
Cities have to fund themselves. As you said, I mean, inland places will tax the peasant to fund itself. But where do the cities' money come from? It comes from the markets. The stronger the markets, the better off the cities, and that's what is happening in some of these cities in the late 18th century, early 19th century.
How does the British East India Company react to these migrations?
We have to acknowledge that the European traders, who are mainly confined to the seaboard for lots of reasons, but primarily because they understand the maritime field much better than the inland. So they are, of course, doing a lot of trading in textiles. And textiles is an interesting product because you can actually invite the artisans close to the sea and make them work there, ask them to work there. And many artisanal people or their contractors, headmen, they were very happy to do that. And so that's kind of thing you can organize with something as mobile as textiles. Looms can be transported very easily. People can move, and if they have a secure job. But then there are many other products, especially agricultural products, like indigo, something that Europeans were very interested in. What most Europeans lacked was the means to actually go there and get this stuff. You needed intermediaries, you needed help. Most businesses, you have this equations with local intermediaries, indigenous merchants, bankers, and in a very powerful, very robust way with the British East India Company. I mean, the company couldn't exist without this enormous infrastructure of people who are helping it. Now, that created certain channels into the interior. It didn't actually work in a political sense. I mean, the merchants, after all, will not help you win battles, but they can give you very good information. And for a very long time, the company's main information system, both strategic and commercial, was dependent on Indian merchants and bankers, especially bankers. Bankers knew everybody's credit situation, who is trustworthy, who is not, who is wealthy, who is not.
Yes.
And they would pass that information on to the companies. So the company knew who is loyal and who is wealthy enough. That was a good access route to the interior, if you like. It wasn't used everywhere to the same extent, but it was used in the three major places where the empire first emerged, which is Malabar, Bengal, and Coromandel. In all three, you had very strong collaborative networks, which started as commercial collaboration, but then unfolded into something much bigger, something that will give you access to trade, access to strategic roads.
I guess the general theme, if that I sensed from your book, is that there is almost like a drift rather than a conscious, hey, let's do it, let's take over the land. There is an almost drift where you do this thing and therefore you do that thing and therefore you do the further thing. How does the obvious nature of the military, given that it isn't just a decision, okay, let's march inland because you want more land, it's a more subtle process, you say, but there is the kind of, if not obvious, then at least the implicit presence of violence, warfare all the time. How do we slot into the story?
What happened in the 1740s is that the European warfare had created rivalry between the English and the French company in India. And they were fighting often as proxies in a local warfare. So they were, the most important example was Arcot, which is a very small, very relatively weak state in South India, had a palace conflict over power. And the English and the French took rival sides. And they fought each other. The same, more or less, I mean, that Anglo-French rivalry was very much present in the Battle of Plassey as well, although it's happening in a different theater. But in the process of doing this, I mean, we are looking at maybe 20, 25 years when you have increasingly people who had not fired a gun before, they are being trained to do that. So you have maybe a few hundred Europeans and Indians in the direct employ of the company who are learning how to do this. They still cannot conquer anything. I mean, they're not a good enough power, but they're good as allies. They're good as mercenaries, and that's how the army, the military project starts. It's not a great start, but if you fast forward 30, 40 years, then the things have changed quite dramatically. You have a standing army, very well trained army, and sometimes fewer soldiers than their Indian rivals, but they're much more powerful in the battlefield because these are all salaried soldiers.
But so is the story basically then just the fact that, well, the big question is not why do Europeans start having these port cities peppered through African and Asian coast? They do it because they are traders and they want to go, and they happen to have pretty decent guns for whatever reason, and therefore they're also able to set up a camp typically where they want, and then they do a lot of trade, which means that the local business people are not against them being there. And the question is why in some places this initial phase becomes genuine governance, land grabs, where it's not that you have a state taxing farmers and then you have a little business enterprise or a big business enterprise, but in some places and not others, one grows into the other. How much is the story of the weather, of the sea breeze, of the dry soil? Let me try an alternative way to think about this, which would be to look at what did the Europeans need. And here the story would be one where in the beginning you have very, very high profits to be made from trading luxury goods, spice, textiles, silk. And you don't need you need a lot of them, surprising quantities, but not that much. And so having your ships be able to sit somewhere is what you really want. And then you fight against piracy, or you become a pirate. You fight for the port.
And fight each other.
And especially with each other, I guess, yes. And this is the kind of phase one that happens across Afro-Eurasia. But then what happens is that in this period that you've highlighted as the transition period, the late 1700s, the Industrial Revolution is one of the reasons the textile trades becomes less important, because the British don't want Indian cloth so much anymore because they make cheaper, less good quality, but nevertheless cheaper cloth themselves. And spices also apparently have lost a lot of the margins are lower. I don't know at all why they are lower, but that's how much I know, is that the spice trade is not so lucrative anymore.
Yeah.
And so you used to bring in luxury textiles, which are produced on the coast, because that's where you want them to be produced. So you pay people to produce them there. You bring in spice, which is brought from somewhere, but it's not that big of a deal in terms of the bulk numbers. And suddenly now you don't want luxury textiles, but you want cotton. You want cotton because the cotton is what the British Industrial Revolution needs. You want opium because that's how you fix your trade balance with China. So in the Indian context, for example, you move into these very land-intensive things that you need. And that also is the period where you march inland and start taking control. And so I guess that there would be, what do you think of an alternative competing story where, of course, weather matters, but what really matters is just the question of what do the Europeans need, what do they want? And the moment they start wanting something which is very land intensive, lo and behold, they are the landlords.
Yeah, well, that's a great question. I mean, the big problem with land intensive goods is that they grow out there and you have to go and get them. Now, you can solve that problem by having merchants subduing the supply side. And as I said, I mean, many of these merchants were moving into the ports. Now, what were they doing before? They were grain merchants. They were cotton merchants. Bombay's textile factories were set up by cotton merchants who came from Gujarat. And they had been doing this trade for hundreds of years. Then they came to the cities. And when you have that kind of a bridge created by not so much Europeans, but by intermediaries. You have the same thing in West Africa. You have the same thing in Indonesia. You need those intermediaries to bring those goods over and load them onto ships. Then you have solved this problem. I can deal in land-intensive goods. Now, the interesting question here is, why wouldn't a European go into the village? Why do they need this dependence? And there are different ways of answering that. And one of the critical ones is that it's not a business that a European can do. All land-based investments require credit, and you are giving credit to some of the poorest people out there. Some of the people who have they're never going to give you any collateral. If there is a bad season, you will lose your money, and they can't do anything. You need them again for next season to grow the crops. It's a very high risk business, and it's only people who are rooted in the village or very close to it. I mean, who can actually speak the language, who have a network there, who can run that operation. So the British actually tried setting up cotton plantations in the American style in South India and failed.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Quite a few British individuals, American individuals, were invited into South India in the 1840s, 1850s, set up plantations. And they they said that it's not going to be a business. These merchants know that world much better. So then it moved to this sort of collaborative arrangements where you have a huge role for Indian merchants. The same thing happened in the Chinese coast. The companies were the reason why the company or the Europeans could stay confined into Hong Kong or Shanghai and develop their business there is that there's an army of intermediaries who would supply them stuff.
But hold on a second. That's absolutely right. But I think that just then begs explanation to why did India and China go such dramatically different pathways, and to what extent does it have to do with India having this monsoon climate and China having more stable climate? I guess let's why don't we focus on just this China-India comparison in the simplest possible terms. Given that both in China and in India there were these port cities, there was reliance, there were no plantations. This is not America. There was a lot of domestic involvement. Why did the British nevertheless end up ruling India?
Well, the single most important difference is state capacity. I mean, in terms of quantified measures of state capacity, India was a fragmented polity before the British took over. There was not just one state there, and the Mughals ruled northern India, the Indo-Gangetic basin, but not very much else. And once they started breaking up, there were at least 6 or 7 major contending powers, and then you had Afghans coming from Afghanistan and trying to take over Delhi. So you have a much more fluid and fragmented politics in India before any kind of colonization happens. Now, the reason why that matters is that the British are actually, in the beginning, they are just one ally among many in this game. So they are not dealing with one state, unlike China, Persia, or Ottoman. That's partly that has to do with partly has to do with the answer. But the other answer is climate. Yes, I mean, if you just look at the climatic map of the world, you will see that India is a far more arid zone than China. Much of China. I mean, China has a huge arid zone to the west side, but if you have a stable, reasonably stable empire ruling over these diverse agricultural climatic zones, then you have a portfolio of different types of climates from which resources are coming in. That kind of diversity wasn't quite present in India, and for some of the dry region states, it wasn't there. I mean, they were very weak. I mean, Mysore was not exactly dry, but it really struggled to raise money.
Money is quite interesting there. I mean, in some sense, what happens is that the British power keeps growing because they are the ones who pay the best. They are the ones who pay their allies. They are the ones who give often loans. They can pay the Indian infantry is better than the competitors. So how much do you think that, in some sense, the way that the British takeover of India happens is a question of them always, the British East India Company always having most what I guess the economists would call fiscal power?
Yeah, no, it's a very good question, and it's kind of makes sense of a lot of the administrative political discussion that is happening in the 1760s, 1770s. I mean, everywhere, money is everywhere. It is the thing that people trying to consolidate power will have to solve. that there are, on the margins, there are lots of potential conflicts. What do we do with, how stable is our power? And that's a problem that the company officers on the ground are trying to solve for about 20 years. They don't have a single solution. I mean, there are basically two solutions here. I mean, they act exactly like an indigenous state, which means that you rely on warlords, chiefs, local chiefs, regional aristocrats, and rely on them. And the other option is don't rely on anybody. Create this infantry where everybody is paid a salary from the central treasury. So they are only loyal to the central treasury. They know that they have nowhere to go. Now they take the second road, but only after trying the first road for quite some time. But when they take the second road, it cannot just be done without institutional reforms. So one of the first major institutional reforms happens in land, where they create this property right regime where they deal directly with the taxpayers, the landlords, rather than with tax collectors. So they turn some of these tax collectors into landlords and then say that you will now pay the tax to me, to the central treasury. And they cut out a lot of the commissions that were lost earlier in the process. And that was a huge change. It delivered a lot more money in the first 20, 30 years after this reform. The reform happened in 1793. And they used that money to build a military. I mean, almost all the money was going into building a standing army.
Two questions. One is, how much was the European advantage? Because there clearly was one, because wherever they put their port cities, in almost all of the cases, by early 20th century, in some sense, these territories, the inland was also under European control. Not always. China is, for example, a trend where it wasn't, but in most cases. How much was it from the very beginning an economic versus a military advantage?
There wasn't exactly a military advantage over local states until you reached the 19th century. It was an economic advantage. I mean, access to more resources, and also access to the sea, which is something that the Europeans understood much better than almost any Indian sea power.
And so was it really, if we have to explain to a child who's like, why did Europe end up being the ruler? Because they had ships, and the best ships, and when you have ships, you can trade things from places where they're not so valuable to places where they are valuable. And that makes you rich, and then you're rich and you can pay a lot of people to fight wars for you. I mean, is that the story?
That's certainly one part of the story. The other part is that the states which were ruling there were divided states, and many of these, the lobbies which divided them, wanted the Europeans to come. Let's say in Malabar, that was very important. Malabar is on the west coast, and on the east coast you have Madras. What is in between is a huge mountain, and there is just one major pass that goes through that mountain. If you control that pass, you can colonize South India. And the British took it over because the people, the merchant communities who peopled in that particular pass, they allied with the British.
And why did they align with the British?
There is this general idea in the history of that time, largely explored by some Cambridge historians in the 1980s, that the Indian merchants saw the East India Company as a compatible entity because the East India Company was also a merchant firm. So they trusted it rather more than the warlords. And there was a class-based alliance there, which didn't actually have to immediately deliver an alliance. But if both parties are in political trouble, as the Malabar merchants were when Mysore under Tipu Sultan started expanding southward, they are more likely to respond to the East India Company quite favorably.
Interesting. And how, if listeners now hear that also the way that East India Company got South India to the extent that it did was because the local merchants aligned with them, and then they generalized this in their mind as, oh, that's how the East India Company spread. Is it roughly an accurate idea with some caveats, or is it very much just this one case and we need to take completely different stories when we look at other places?
Well, that's a great question. I think it's an idea that works for this time of in the empire's emergence.
And that is
Let's say between 1760 and 1780.
okay.
By 1784, the British Parliament has effectively taken over the administration of India, which means also the fiscal and military enterprise. So effectively, Britain is indirectly still, but governing India in a much more like a political power. But the beginning started in 1772 and in another parliamentary act. Now, when you have that, you can think of India as an empire. Until then, it's ruled by a merchant firm. But yeah, I mean, the company, effectively, it's that transitional time when the company is still primarily a firm trying to fight battles. And that's what these alliances explain.
Next question. How much can the India, even India is very diverse. What happens in the south and north is not always the same. But how similar? I mean, I'm wondering how similar is the process really anywhere else? Because I can imagine someone coming in and saying, look, if you just compare India and China, you get a pretty neat story. China has a more benign climate, therefore they have a more continuous state bureaucracy. Therefore, the Europeans never really challenged the state bureaucracy; they just set up their ports.
Yeah.
In India, the inland has more high risk situation. It creates a more fragmentary, less continuous state bureaucracy. Therefore, the Europeans end up taking over the bureaucracy. In, for example, Somalia, the inland is so arid, so dry, that the Italians can try to get Italians to go there, but no one actually wants to stay. So there's like a pretty clean way in which these map onto some basic climate patterns. But then if we look at Southeast Asia, in Burma, British Burma, for example, it looks nothing like the Indian story that we've discussed, where you have this slow drift where alliances is very much a military operation because it's a competitor. There are wars of conquest. So I think something quite similar happens in Vietnam when the French take over Vietnam. And by the way, some of these areas are very, very wet, more China-like than they are India-like. And what happens in Congo, for example, well, yes, King Leopold, it was his private property, so to speak, but there's another way to explain it, which is that there was a massive need for rubber, and Congo was a very productive rubber region, so the Europeans just created the most extractive raw material project in history. It looks very, very different. In this case, you don't plug yourself into the existing bureaucracy like in India and make it work for yourself. You just forget that anyone was there before and make people work for you. And so, in some sense, the question is that we get very different patterns in New World versus the Old World. This is how we opened the conversation. But do we even get very similar patterns across the Old World, or do we just have to take everything bit by bit? You know, this is what happens in India, this is what happens in West Africa, this is what happens in Southeast Asia, mainland Southeast Asia, this is what happens in the archipelagos of Southeast Asia. Is there a common story that should even be attempted, or are these just, or is the only common denominator the fact that the Europeans have their ships and their money, and therefore they have fiscal power to do what they want?
Well, I mean, certainly that matters because you do have the presence of Europeans everywhere. I mean, you don't have Indians in the Americas, but you do have Europeans. But I think the two other generalizations that you can make here is one, when you look at this. The emergence of European states when already powerful states were in place, whether it's in India or in West Africa, you have a role for alliances and role for negotiations. It's never outright conquest. And in the case of West Africa, once again, I mean, in that case, in that kind of context where the European empires are emerging, state capacity is a very important concept because people join alliances sometimes out of fear or out of a threat, and many people did that in India, did that in West Africa, and that threat comes from the fact that there is no indigenous state strong enough to protect you, or some warlords think that their future is not very well protected by the indigenous empires. The Europeans had a better deal. Now, that kind of alliances explain the emergence of empire, with the difference that in West Africa, a big part of state capacity story is the end of slave trade. So it's not so. Climate is part of it, West Africa has a very similar climate to India. Semi-arid interior, quite an extensive zone, but all the actions are happening on the coast. So West Africa, yes, the emergent story where you have alliances, state capacity, threats, climate, all are part of the mix. Um, that's the emergent story. Once you have a state, which is happening from the late 19th century, even in Burma's case, it happens quite early because the army emerges quite early in India. And it's the army in India which is fighting in Burma.
Wait, when you say once you have a state, what do you mean?
Once you have a state, meaning a fiscal system, a tax system that you control completely.
The Europeans control.
In this case, the Europeans, yes. In India's case,
Yes,
the
okay.
Europeans. And a military force that you control completely, that is not dependent on other people. Once you have that, the conquest, the colonization that happened is a very different game from the emergent story. So you can actually create this infrastructure very powerfully against a weaker state. That's what is going on in Burma. That's what happens in Southeast Asia to some extent. The Congo example is an exception to both of these because Congo is not a state. It's a mistake to call it a colonial state. It's an opportunistic capture, but it's a private estate. It doesn't have these institutions. But Congo aside, I think in terms of chronology, you have these two big generalizations. If you have this infrastructure of a state, you can colonize. If you don't have it, create alliances.
What would be the textbook example of the first and the second?
Of what I would call this alliance pathway of emergence, it would be India. That's the first example. The conquest path of emergence you can find in many other places. In most of the rest of Asia, you can find that. Maybe East Africa, you can find that. But, well, you mentioned Burma. I think Burma is a very good example of that. I mean, you already have essentially the British Indian army is fighting imperial wars in lots of places. And these are breaking out in the second half of the 19th century. It's happening in East Africa. It's happening in large parts of Southeast Asia. In Malaya, in Burma, of course. In Singapore is almost a kind of province of India for a very long time. So, and of course in Hong Kong, the British Indian Army is present everywhere. And once you have that asset, no problem. You can think of the globe as a big field to operate. But the precondition for that is already a powerful state somewhere. In most cases, that somewhere is not Britain. It's British India.
Very good. Before we draw to a close, any speculations on the earliest origins of Europe's the table tilting, the Eurasian table tilting? I mean, at year 1000, there was no military industrial edge in far western Eurasia. When do the tables start to tilt towards the west, and why?
A fascinating question, and you can only speculate. But I think, in my mind, the critical juncture is when some of these early navigators are starting to think in terms of connecting the Atlantic with the Indian Ocean, whether in terms of knowledge of navigable routes, in terms of ports, in terms of people out there. When they start doing that, things look very different. Not in terms of control, but in terms of just understanding of how the world is. And I kind of think of, I mean, there are lots of maritime traders and seaside societies and ship owners, shipwrights in India, in West Asia, in Africa, in Southeast Asia, in China. I cannot think of any single individual or any single community group who actually do this, who think in terms of connecting their field of operation with the Atlantic. Europeans start doing that.
Very good. Well, I think that's a good place to close. My final question for all guests is how has all your work shaped your outlook on humanity?
I'm fascinated by how people in the tropical world adapt and struggle against their climatic condition. I find that quite heroic, and it's a very long history. And there is really one point agenda here, which is how to avoid droughts by storing water. And you look anywhere, you look almost any field, whether it's archaeology or history or development, you see this come up again and again. But it's also a human story. And to get back to your question, I mean, I would really try to understand how this reflects in cultures.
Professor Tirthankar Roy, thank you so much for your time today.
Sure, enjoyed this.
Okay, so that was it for today. Thanks for sticking with us until the very end. If you enjoyed this, definitely hit the subscribe button. Feel free to rate the show if you feel that I deserve it, and share the episode forward if you think that more people would enjoy it. If you're interested more in the topic, do head to the February episodes on What About India with Professor Bishnupriya Gupta. And stay tuned for more episodes on this feed in a week or two. Until then, take care.